By Richard Haass. Dr. Haass is, of course, the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, the president, actually. He's the author of A World in Disarray, Foreign Policy Begins at Home, many influential articles, former distinguished public servant. Good morning, Richard. Welcome back.
Morning, Mr. Hewitt. How are you?
I'm terrific. Well, actually, I'm not terrific. I've seen much better times in the United States. Richard, before I go to your article, President the Destruction, and we've got 15 minutes here, so we have a chance to walk into it. I want to begin as I began with Secretary of State Pompeo yesterday. By the way, did you see that interview that I did with the Secretary yesterday?
I read it.
Okay, good. Same thing I asked him. The Global Times editorial threatens a crisis in the next 10 days, even a storm. They will teach Taiwan secessionists a lesson, nail Pompeo and the likes to the pillars of shame. Do you fear a major incident in the short term with China?
I can't rule it out. I don't think it's likely. It's not the first time in recent years they've used this kind of muscular rhetoric. But look, let's take a step back. I think what the Secretary of State announced over the weekend, basically more normal interaction with Taiwan, in and of itself isn't, to me, wrong. What I think is wrong is to do it absent the context where we can provide the kind of deterrence and, if need be, defense of Taiwan working with our allies. So it was all symbol what we did the other day, without really building a much safer environment for Taiwan. And the stakes there include Taiwan, but obviously include our relations with Japan, South Korea, and everybody else. That's my problem with what Mike Pompeo did. I don't know I doubt, I guess, that China is going to act out, but I do think they'll do something. Could be in the economic area, could be some ships could be in the area, airplanes could challenge airspace. That basically a station identification to let Taiwan know, don't use this as an excuse to move in the direction of independence.
Now, also at the same time, Iran's Navy has begun a short-range missile drill in the Gulf of Oman, not unprecedented but provocative, and they've seized a freighter. Are they likely to do anything in the next week that is requiring an American response?
I doubt it, only because you've got the Iranian elections in 5 or 6 months. More important, I think they want to see what the new Biden administration does, and I don't think they want to necessarily preclude some changes that they might actually welcome. The only really hard thing dealing with Iran, unlike China, if China wants to do something, or if it happens, it's because Xi Jinping ordered it.
Yes.
With Iran, you've got divided authority, and things could happen because the Revolutionary Guard do something or some militia do something. It's a little bit trickier with Iran making predictions because you have such a distribution of authority.
You're right. The Secretary of State noted yesterday President Xi will give the order if anything happens in Taiwan. Okay, so here's the key question before we go to President the Destruction. If there is a provocation, a significant, either by the Chinese or by the Iranians in the next week, will President Trump be justified in responding if indeed time is of the essence?
If there's a provocation, I think he's justified in reacting. Then you have to look at what's the scope of the provocation, what's the scope of the reaction. But he's still the president for the next week. We've only got one president at a time, not two, but also not zero.
No, I love that. That's exactly what I wanted people to hear before anything happens. Now, the walk up to President the Destruction, Richard, do you think the Abraham Accords are a good thing?
Yes. I think they are. The idea of normalizing relations between Israel and the Sunni Arab countries, I think, is a very good thing.
Did you think the move of the embassy to Jerusalem was a good thing?
I would not have done it, certainly not in isolation. It was a major card to play, and I would have gotten something significant from the Israeli government if I were going to do it. I also would have done it in the context of providing something for the Palestinians. So it's not in and of itself wrong. How it was carried out was wrong.
Has it worked out well?
Not particularly. There's been no progress in relations or issues with the Palestinians. And Israel is moving farther along a path where it's going to one day have to choose between being a democratic state and a Jewish state. And I don't see that as being in Israel's long-term interest.
Okay, it's an interview, not a debate, but I will note that I think that the move of the embassy and the recognition of the annexation led to the Abraham Accords, which are important. Are the NATO increases in defense spending a good thing?
Absolutely, though the challenge with NATO is not simply how much it spends, but how it spends it. My problem with NATO, and I hope the Biden approach is different, basically says, yeah, let's think about how we spend money, because right now we could actually spend as much money as we're spending, not more, and get much more defense for it. Virtually every country in NATO does its defense spending on a national basis. It ought to be done much more on an alliance collective basis.
Next, on the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, there's been a major change in American orientation toward the CCP. I believe it's bipartisan, by the way. I believe everyone has recognized the CCP as the malign actor that it is. Is that a good thing to have that recognition dawn on both parties?
Not particularly. The CCP, the Communist Party of China, is 90-plus million people. It's led by a guy named Xi Jinping. This is the government of China. We may disagree with it profoundly. We should disagree with it profoundly, but it's not going anywhere. So we ought to essentially deal with the government of China we have. It's a little bit like, what was it, Rumsfeld's line? You go to war with the army you have. We've got to do diplomacy with the government we have. I don't much like it, but it's the government of China. Regime change is not in the offing. It's not in the cards. We have major issues to discuss with China, which means with people who are members of the Chinese Communist Party. Let's discuss those major issues. You began this conversation with Taiwan, so let's deal with Taiwan. Let's deal with North Korea. Let's deal with Hong Kong. Let's deal with what they're doing to the Uyghur minority. Let's deal with the theft of intellectual property. Those are all areas we can make some progress on by dealing with people who happen to be members of the Chinese Communist Party. But to go after the party per se, that's not serious foreign policy.
Well, we disagree, because I think you have to know with whom you are dealing. And if you are dealing with a murderous regime, and it is a murderous regime, and I don't think you would dispute that, they are destroying Hong Kong's facade of freedom, and they are imprisoning in concentration gulags Uyghurs by the million. It is an evil regime, is it not?
We're not disagreeing about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party. What I'm saying is to make their removal or ousting.
Well, I'm not saying that either.
Mike Pompeo has been saying it. He has made the Chinese Communist Party a major impediment to U.S.-Chinese dialogue. That's simply not true. We have got to have a serious dialogue with this China, led by the Chinese Communist Party, for all the issues that you care about.
But this is reminiscent of when I was in the Reagan White House, Richard, and you served too. The president calling the USSR an evil empire did not prevent Reykjavik from happening. And to name that what it is, the CCP, and to describe it accurately, and the virus coming out of Wuhan as having been a terrible disservice of the world. These are accurate statements from which negotiations must proceed if they are to proceed well.
The difference is in the 1950s, when we looked at the Soviet Union, people called for rollback of the Communist Party, and that was rejected. And instead, over the next 35, 40 years, the United States had diplomatic interaction with leaders of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And the last I checked, we won the Cold War peacefully on our terms.
Because we deployed the Pershings and the cruise missiles in 1983, and because Reagan called it an evil empire and called on Gorbachev to tear down the wall. Because he was blunt.
But also because of their own internal flaws, even more, and Gorbachev's mistakes. And because of Afghanistan and what we did there. So we ought to have a comprehensive policy towards the Chinese. We can be critical of the Communist Party, as we should be, but to distinguish right now between the Communist Party of China and the government of China, they're tantamount to the same thing, and we should be focusing on where we disagree on their behavior.
Well, I don't know that we disagree much. I'm very, very happy with the announcement today that President-elect Biden has named Kurt Campbell to be his China expert. He's a hawk, and he's a realist. I do fear we're going to go
to teach together.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, I think what you're going to see is this is going to be a tough policy towards China in this administration. Probably even tougher on some of the human rights issues. Very tough on the South China Sea and Hong Kong. I don't think it's going to be bought off, the new administration, by this or that export-related agreement. Personal diplomacy won't count for as much. But this is going to be a difficult relationship. It should be a difficult relationship, given the many things the Chinese are up to.
Now, I've met Wendy Sherman once. I think she's a very nice person, and I've met Tony Blinken, and he's good friends with my friend Poneman. So I know they're expert, but I fear waking up someday to find that the 9-dash line has been recognized in exchange for carbon reduction commitments in 2080, Richard.
I think there's no chance of that happening. Again, people like Kurt Campbell, who you just mentioned, the others are very these are realists on China. They've got important connections with other countries in the region. So my guess is there'll be no change in U.S. policy in the South China Sea. We're not going to recognize what the Chinese are proclaiming, and periodically we will challenge them and we will assert our right to sail through these waters.
Now, Richard, you've written this article, President the Destruction, Trump's final act has accelerated the onset of a post-American world, that says it begins from the beginning, the essence of Trump foreign policy has been disruption of the arrangements and policies that largely served the United States well for 3/4 of a century. You go on to argue that the images of last week have reinforced in our fellow democracy something is seriously wrong here, and that allies have little choice but to question their decision to entrust the security of the United States. The violence of the United States Capitol has been repeatedly denounced here, and during the actual demonstration, the FBI has arrested 130 people. But Richard, I heard a speech by George Shultz 10 years ago when he dedicated my law school at Chapman, saying that the post-war order was crumbling. This was before Trump came down the escalator. He said every institution from Bretton Woods forward was falling apart, that NATO had fallen out. What exactly is different because of Trump than what's happening already? The post-World War II order is over.
I don't think it's over. I think the post-World War II order and the institutions still exist. Some of them clearly have not done well with the passage of time, but NATO's still doing okay. You've got things like the International Monetary Fund. You've got the World Bank. You've got the World Trade Organization, all flawed, admittedly, but the basics are there, American leadership in the world. I think the biggest problem with Donald Trump and why history will be so harsh is he inherited the disorder, as I described, imperfect and flawed, and rather than strengthening it, he accelerated its decline. And almost like healthcare, he pulled the rug out from under it without replacing it with something better. That's my problem with Donald Trump.
Now, I wonder, though, when you say that people have to worry about America's providing security, Australia despaired of the Obama administration's foreign policy. Our allies in the Sunni world despaired of the Iranian deal. Our allies despaired of the Syrian genocide. Our allies despaired of the Crimean attack and the annexation of Crimea and the attack on Ukraine. I think Donald Trump has done much better in foreign policy than President Obama did. I believe that's actually objectively true. And the Abraham Accords, of course, are the crowning achievement. How do you respond to that? Again, putting aside last week, because last week is terrible, but there are 4 years before last week, Richard.
Look, there are things that Trump did in foreign policy I approve of. You mentioned some of them, arming Ukraine, the Abraham Accords, the U.S., Mexico, Canada trade agreement, tougher line towards China. And there's things with the Obama administration I disagreed with, beginning with Syria and the non-response to the crossing of the red line there as a critic of the Iran nuclear deal. My problem with Trump is, again, in virtually every area, from the World Health Organization to the Iran deal, he pulled out without putting something better in its place. He's isolated the United States. And I simply look at the country and the world, and to use a Ronald Reagan line, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Hell no. We're not.
Oh, boy, do we disagree.
Than we were 4 years ago.
Boy, do we disagree. Another conversation, another time. I think we're much better off than we were 4 years ago. If only because of the sequester, Richard. Last word to you. The sequester was on when he came in. The defense has been rebuilt since he left.
Well, that's another conversation for another day. I think on balance on that, we are far worse off domestically and far worse off internationally. And to me, that will be his legacy. He left the country and the world in much worse shape than he founded it.
Richard, thank you for joining me. It's always good to talk.